Alright, my darlings, well, the most miserable time of the year is here once again, but for me that means talking about a show that has absolutely nothing to do with the time of year, but it's a show that I wanted to talk about, and it actually has to do with something that I've not yet covered on this show: comic books. I've made references to comics many times on my show, but I've never really looked at them under my spotlight. But now is the time to say it. I love comic books. Marvel, DC, and even the independents, they bring me so much enjoyment. But we're not looking at comics specifically today. Instead, we'll be looking at something that most executives seem to think is the only reason that comic books exist: comic book movies and TV shows. I think we'd be hard-pressed to find someone who hasn't seen at least one Marvel Cinematic Universe movie these days, and I'm certainly not one of them, because I've seen every single one, except Incredible Hulk. And I love them all. They are some of my all-time favourite movies, and favourite movie series of all time. But these are of course not the only comic book to screen adaptations. Those go as far back as when comics first started appearing on newspaper racks in the 1940s. With Superman and Batman getting film serials and cartoons as far back as then. But while DC may not be able to hold a candle to Marvel in the film world right now, they've got them beat in the small screen world. DC have been the masters at putting their capes onto the telly as far back as the 60s, with both live action and animated shows about Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman and the Justice League being some of the best and most beloved TV shows of all time. And while Marvel does have some claims in that area with the original Spider-Man animated series, the Incredible Hulk live action series and the 90s Spider-Man and X-Men series, DC have always had their dominance on the small screen world over Marvel, though that power struggle is starting to get a lot tighter these days. If DC ever needs to, they can always rely on their flagship hero, Batman. While I'll fully admit I'm more of a Superman fan than a Batman fan, I also can't deny that there's a lot more to appreciate about The Dark Knight than Super Speedo. I mean, Batman delves into the deep psychology of the human mind and the darkness that lies within men's hearts. Superman is more about the morals of how far a man can go with great power. Batman has the greatest rogues gallery of any superhero besides maybe Spider-Man, whereas the average person on the street could probably only care to mention Lex Luthor and maybe General Zod in terms of Superman's villain repertoire. Batman is about how any person can overcome any difficulties and do the right thing no matter what. Superman is about when a person can go too far in helping people and whether getting involved in other people's problems is actually a good thing or not. I'm not saying this makes one better than the other, but it does mean that Batman has a lot more opportunities and versatility in writing in terms of a comic book hero, and that is definitely true of these two outside of comics. In terms of outside comic media, Bruce Wayne has been beating Clark Kent with a kryptonite slipper since the 70s. Since Superman, while having some great movies, TV shows and one or two cartoons, those were rather few and far between and often would fly too close to the sun and get a bit burnt out. Whereas Batman, while suffering from the same problems sometimes, just keeps going with movies, TV shows, cartoons, video games, and especially merchandise. Let's face it, you can only sell the same Superman cape to kids for over 50 years before they start getting bored of it. But with Batman, just slap a new Bat logo on something and it's a new Bat gadget. This certainly rings true with cartoons, since Superman has only had really one major cartoon success post the 1950s. The Superman animated series from the 90s. And while it is a fantastic cartoon, it was really only made because the Batman animated series was so popular, and they decided to expand the franchise with Superman. And this eventually led to the Justice League cartoon, which is one of the greatest cartoons of all time, but this is more Batman's doing than Superman's. And in 2004, they decided to recreate the success with an all-new Batman cartoon, simply known as The Batman. Now you're probably wondering why I'm looking at this series as opposed to the more well-known and beloved Batman the Animated Series. But the reason is that this show is the reason I was exposed to Batman. This is the show where I learned about many classic Batman characters like Bane, Hugo Strange, Man-Bat and Clayface. So this show is basically the reason I got into DC Comics in the first place. I was already a fan of Marvel Comics at the time, so this helped me become a traitor of both sides of the comic war. This series was an attempt to be a new Batman animated series for the 2000s, which is understandable. While the Justice League series was still running at the time, there is a bit too much baggage in terms of backstory and the insane amount of characters for a newcomer to get into DC Comics, but a new solo series is perfect for getting a new generation engaged. And while, like I said, I'm more of a Superman fan, Batman is probably the best place to start, since he's not only a great stepping on point for DC newbies, but he's also a great starting point for kids to get into more mature and gritty forms of stories. This series does go in different directions than previous Batman shows have before. This Batman is only just starting out at the time the series begins, and they decide to go for a bit more of a Marvel method where the public and the police force are in suspicion of him and see him as just as much of a criminal as the other loonies in Gotham. It certainly was an interesting way of taking the series, and it really is a great microcosm of the series as a whole, since this series takes a lot of leads from Marvel in its presentation. The biggest example of that would be Batman himself. Most versions of Batman before and since have established that Bruce Wayne is more of a disguise than Batman, since when he puts on that mask, he becomes his true self. Whereas this Batman makes more of a distinction between the two, where Bruce Wayne is a more sarcastic and light-hearted man.
Hot tea and a lozenge, sir? Cold drink on a warm beach? The Batwave? Another time, then. Tahiti'll have to wait.
And Batman is a lot more witty and quippy with his work.
Crocs may like water, but they're no fish. So, either of you up for giving Lizard Lips a little mouth-to-mouth? Knight takes Bishop.
And they make it clear that neither of the two sides of this coin is more of a facade than the other. They have much more of a harmony between each other. It's really an interesting way of taking the character for once, and in many ways it feels more like Spider-Man in that regard. Which is fitting because Rina Romano, Bruce's voice actor, has played Spider-Man many times in the past.
Maybe it's time to do Naoko and Shane a favor and say adios to this rock and take my chances at home without John Jameson.
Easy, Alfred. The Batman's right where he likes, hovering below the radar.
Speaking of which, while the higher voice is a bit of a distraction while listening to him, especially when he's in the Batsuit, Reno does a really good job as Batman. He really gives him a lot more personality and colour than past versions, and it really works here. I wouldn't go so far as to say he's on the level of Kevin Conroy, but he definitely holds his own. And if Robert Pattinson is going to be playing Batman in the future, this is the one he should probably take the most leads from. Although this Batman did once fight vampires, so maybe he's a bit more afraid of this one. But that's just the tip of the iceberg, as almost every returning character in this series is done in a new and interesting way. Starting with the Joker, who is played by voice acting god Kevin Michael Richardson.
I was feeling a bit screw loose, so I checked myself in. Maybe I am a bit batty. Blame it on the bats in my belfry.
Who you may recognise from many things, but his portrayal of the Joker is so entertaining to watch, and one of his all-time best roles. His version of the Joker is a lot more manic, jokey, and less dark and demented than other versions, but it really works with his voice. And there are some moments when he can be really scary, especially with his design.
Water's warm, Batman! Dive in! When Joker's through clowning with you, you won't know where to find your mind! All it takes is one rotten day to transform a normal man into a monster! Well, in my case, a rotten day and a chemical bath.
Though some of his threats do sound a bit like innuendos.
I won't break your bones, detective. I'm going to snap your twig.
Matron. He's also shown to be a lot more acrobatic and eccentric than other Jokers, which also fits with his voice and design. Again, I wouldn't put him up there with Mark Hamill, but certainly a good yin to Batman's yang in this show. There's Penguin, who is shown to be a bit more of a middle ground between the jokey version of Burgess Meredith and the sinister version of Danny DeVito.
The good old days when Cobblepots were king are coming back. 'Cause I am gonna restore the Cobblepot name to its former wealth and glory. Foul play!
Plus he gets to show off his fighting skills for once, which is great to see. There's the Riddler, who is far more sinister and mysterious than any other versions of him, and is voiced by, no joke, Freddy Krueger himself, Robert Englund.
Someone is very bright. Step into the light so the Riddler can see you.
He's also got a much more sympathetic backstory this time around, and really makes this version of the Riddler much more compelling and deep than other versions. There's Killer Croc, who is much more slick and sly, and is voiced by Ron Perelman.
You best give it up, Bat. By the time they figure out what caused the flood, downtown Gotham will be my personal swamp.
Mr. Freeze, who is a lot more like his Silver Age version as just a common criminal who is in the wrong place at the wrong time, but is blood-chillingly creepy.
Reaction time slows, reflexes grow sluggish. Next come the hallucinations, lack of consciousness, and finally, the big chill.
The ventriloquist, whose version of Scarface more resembles a 1970s gangster and is voiced by Homer Simpson.
That we swipe tonight. Then we'll have everything we need to pull off the biggest heist in Gotham history.
But in my opinion, the best characters in this show are Alfred, Clayface, and Harley Quinn. This show quite possibly has the best Alfred of any Batman in the entire franchise, and while Alfred is always a great character to see in any Batman media, this one is far more sarcastic, far more colourful, and has way more personality than any other version.
The glass has been seared, just like at the research lab 2 nights ago.
Off you go then.
Most versions of Alfred portray him as a surrogate father figure to Bruce Wayne, but this one treats him more like an overbearing and funny big brother, one who speaks with Batman on more equal terms and always has a great quote up his sleeve.
Both were highly theatrical public humiliations.
Oh, like those newfangled extreme game shows from Japan. I sometimes watch the telly while I'm dusting. You, on the other hand, never were much for games, even as a child.
There was work to do.
Play is the work of children.
He's also got more levels to him than just a snooty butler. In Penguin's debut episode, we see him angry since his grandfather was the butler to the Cobblepots in England and they apparently didn't treat him too well.
Grandpa Pennyworth worked himself to the bone for those wretched snobs, and they treated him like a stray dog. Then had the nerve to fire him.
In Q&A, we see him nerd out, since one of the key clues to the case in this episode is linked to one of his favourite old TV shows.
A game show for kids called
Think, Thank, Thunk. Put on your thinking caps. I've done a lot of dusting over the years.
And in Big Dummy, we get to see him joke around.
Oh, yes. He's clearly a smuggler. And that chap screams embezzler if ever there was one.
He is by far the best Alfred in all of Batman history, and one I wish future versions would take more inspiration from, but he's by far my favourite character in this show. But Clayface does come a close second. Clayface has always been an intriguing villain. His powers and abilities make him a true force to be reckoned with, but his backstory is rather generic as a Silver Age hero. But this show decided to completely revamp his origin. Instead of being forgotten B-movie actor, and Boris Karloff allegory Basil Karlo, this time Clayface is the best friend of Bruce Wayne, and struggling GCP detective, Ethan Bennett. The way they use Bennett as a supporting character into a villain is very much like Two-Face in that regard. However, I feel that the major problem with Two-Face in any version of him outside of comics is that we never get to know him enough as a character before he becomes a criminal. And while each successive version has tried their best, they never seem to give him enough time to have him grow on us before he gets half of his face burnt off. But Ethan is always there. From the first episode, he's established as Bruce Wayne's best and oldest friend, all the way back from high school, and he's got a great personality.
What's he look like?
Dude like you and me, except he wears bat jammers.
Oh my goodness! That's game! Dogs are on you, dog!
Being this sort of mix between the cool, streetwise attitude of Aaron Cash and the desperate, reliable cop and ally of Jim Gordon, who, ironically enough, doesn't really start appearing in this series until after Ethan stops showing up more often. Ethan is also the only character in the early episodes who sees Batman as a hero rather than a legal vigilante.
Bats may be a criminal, but he's my kind of criminal.
Which makes him butt heads with his partner, the by-the-books Detective Yin, and the intolerant Chief Rojas, which causes him to start to lose his mind. And when the Joker kidnaps him and tortures him in a manner that is oddly similar to what he did to Gordon in The Killing Joke, Ethan starts to question what the point of everything is, which isn't helped by him melting after the Joker sprays him with a special gas that turns objects into putty, which is just as disturbing as you think it might be. From then on, it basically follows the typical story that it would for Two-Face, but with Clayface instead. But even so, I really commend the show for going in a different direction with an established character like this. In a way, it was really risky, but I think it really worked. And similar to Two-Face, Clayface jumps back and forth from being a stone-cold criminal to an uneasy ally for Batman. It's really cool and I really liked it. Basil Karlo does eventually show up in the series, but even then he was changed around from his comic book counterpart, and he was really only introduced to bring the final part of Ethan's character development to resolution, and replace Ethan as Clayface for the rest of the series. But even with that, I truly feel this may be the best version of both Clayface and Two-Face ever done in Batman history. His character development also leads to Batman opening up and letting more people into his life as a crime fighter, which is one of the major pieces of character development throughout the series, which starts with him creating a strong alliance with Detective Yin, who previously was his biggest enemy in the GCPD, but eventually comes around to Batman and becomes his most important ally. Until she disappears after season 2 and is replaced by Batgirl, but it was an interesting way of tackling the whole Batman won't trust anybody trope. As with Harley Quinn, well, unlike Alfred and Clayface, I can't say she's one of the best in the franchise because she's not that different in terms of personality from the animated series beforehand, and she wasn't even used that often in the show either. But what I really love about this version of Harley Quinn is her backstory. Harley Quinn's origin as a character is one that I think has good elements to it, but it doesn't really make sense the more you think about it. Hear me out! The idea of someone falling in love with a psychotic criminal because they see something in them that adds new meaning to their life is a brilliant idea, and it's kind of a reverse of Silence of the Lambs, but while the initial idea is brilliant, the way it's executed doesn't exactly make a whole lot of sense. I know that Arkham isn't exactly the best run asylum in the world, but I think even they would know that you don't let the new intern girl, who clearly isn't very smart or has a lot of common sense, try and unravel the mind of a man whose psyche is so complex it makes a double helix look like a Fisher-Price jigsaw puzzle. In The Batman, though, they take a few different steps from A to B to make her into a lackey who is obsessed with the Joker. They make her a bit more believable this time. Instead of making her an intern at Arkham, they make her a psychology TV personality with her own call-in show, and the Joker was one of her most regular callers. Of course, she didn't know it was the Joker until she met him, but her constant dialogues with him allow her to grow a slow fascination with him, and when she finally meets him in person, his wild personality and charm win her over. Admittedly, this backstory does rob us of the intimacy that the original one gave us, but this feels like a much more believable circumstance. And I know that saying in a series where a man dresses up like a bat and fights an evil clown that a dumb blonde with barely any qualifications can be made to treat her world's equivalent of Charles Manson on her first day is unrealistic, but I feel this just works better. Maybe in the future if we have a middle ground here, like how Harley starts off as a talk show host that gets way too ahead of herself and demands to treat the Joker so he can be put on her show, and pulls some strings to force Arkham into treating him in private, and then he starts to win her over, then perhaps we could have the perfect Harley backstory. But while this version of Harley is not quite up there with Arlene Sorkin or Tara Strong, I think that there are some elements here that future versions should consider. That being said, while I do love this show, there are a lot of things that it didn't do well, like how while Batman is supposed to be more inexperienced and new, his technology and preparation in his crime fighting make him much more akin to Batman Beyond, with his uber sleek and high-tech car, his jetpack and his secret tunnels all around Gotham. It doesn't make sense how he's this prepared if he's just starting out. Also, the animation, while very good, I feel that it doesn't stylistically always work with the Batman. Those of you watching may think the style looks familiar, and that's because the designs are done by the same guy who did Jackie Chan Adventures, Jeff Masuda, whose style is best described as edgy, and I mean that very literally. He almost never uses rounded edges in any of his designs. It's almost always sharp and jagged edges. It's like the cartoon equivalent of a car from the 80s, and while I do really like his style, I don't think it necessarily works for Batman. The designs look a bit too exaggerated and cartoony to convey the drama and darkness that Batman usually portrays. And while this does work for some characters like Joker, Riddler, Clue Master and Clayface, others like the Penguin, Bane and Mr. Freeze just don't look like they fit in this world. Funnily enough, it reminds me a lot of the animation from the Teen Titans cartoon, which the Batman was sort of a companion piece for. But in that series it worked because of how upbeat and jokey and light-hearted it was, but it also worked for the darker and more dramatic moments. With these designs though, it can really take you out of the moment when you think it could exist in the same universe as this.
Danger looms in your future.
You listen to a cookie?
Never mock the cookie.
This style would later be adopted by Ben 10, which worked a million times better in that series, so perhaps this was just a market test for that show. Also, a few regular Batman characters don't appear in this series at all, which is a bit disappointing. Two-Face is completely absent, though that makes sense since he's basically been replaced with Clayface. Ra's al Ghul and the Mad Hatter are nowhere to be found, but probably the most disappointing is that Scarecrow is a complete no-show, which is a real shame. There's even an episode with a plot that feels like it should belong to him, but it turned out to be Hugo Strange the whole time. And who could forget the absence of the great, the sinister, and unforgettable Condiment King? But the worst part of this show is how they handled two characters in particular, Batgirl and Robin. I'm gonna have to be very, very blunt with this one. Robin and Batgirl are really annoying little pissants in this version.
There's no room for a Batgirl in Gotham.
That's cool, because it's Batwoman. As in, I'm a grown woman and don't need to listen to you.
Ah, I know. He's about to get his butt kicked. Am I right?
Dude, you just broke the superhero secret identity code.
Allergic to cats. And bad jokes.
Robin, by the way, is French for duh.
I do get what they were trying to go for here, a slightly more realistic take on teen sidekicks, with them being skilled but also rather petulant, angsty and immature. But you have to make sure that everything in this situation comes together perfectly, the writing, the animation, and especially the voice acting. Otherwise it just comes off as annoying and falls into the case of what I like to call the Scrappy situation, as it reminds me a lot of Scrappy-Doo from Scooby-Doo, in that sense of, I'm the best and I can do anything, despite being a tiny little kid who's in way over his head. I also like to call this the Koda complex, as Koda from Brother Bear is the first character I think of besides Scrappy with this issue. And while Barbara and Dick aren't that bad, they definitely aren't as endearing as past versions. My favourite versions of these characters are Burt Ward from the Adam West series and Oracle from the Arkham video games, but these are versions that are far from what you would want in a show like this. But these versions just rub me the wrong way. They do eventually grow on you, but yeah, their first impressions aren't really that great. But at least they didn't get too involved in a pointless story about how they have a really awkward sexual tension with their boss and then bang him out of nowhere. Also, it feels a bit confused about its tone, jumping the line between a more lighter-hearted and fun series and a more serious and deep series, which can be a bit distracting. Say what you will about the 90s series being overly dark, but at least it understood where it was. But this series feels like it's a little bit lost sometimes. But when it wants to be dark and moody, it accomplishes that with panache, and when it wants to be funny, that usually works too. There's also a bunch of characters that, while not done badly, are just kind of there and they don't really do much when all is said and done. There's Catwoman, who, while decent, is really no different from any other version of her in the past. Ragdoll, who is a cool looking and sounding villain, but again, he doesn't do much. Same goes for Firefly and Maxie Zeus. But this is only to be expected with so many characters to juggle at once. Speaking of which, during the last episodes of the penultimate season, and the whole of the final season, they decided to make the show more of a Justice League series, bringing in heroes and villains from other DC comics to try and follow the same journey that the Bruce Timm animated universe did. I can't give too much of an opinion on this, since this was around the time when I stopped watching the show, but it did feel like the show was jumping the shark here. All the moody, subtle and gritty elements of the previous series were now completely gone. And while they were slowly draining away with Batgirl and Robin's inclusion, the rest of the Super Friends showing up just ruined the great feel that the show had. And while I'm not saying that this was a bad idea, it might have been better if they followed the Bruce Timm series more and tested the waters with a new series about another member of the Justice League, like Flash or Wonder Woman, and then bring them all together for a new animated combined universe. This was just trying to do too much way too soon. Not to say that this didn't give us some great entertainment, it's always great to see Batman and Lex Luthor spar off, since they're basically mirror opposites of each other. Plus the episode with the Martian Manhunter is awesome. But like I said, it tried to bite off more than it could chew, and sadly it seems that audiences felt the same way, as this was the last series of the Batman, and the series was cancelled and faded off into obscurity quite sadly. swiftly followed by the far more popular and successful series Batman Brave and the Bold, which was more of a return to the goofy antics of the Silver Age comics and the Adam West series. I'm not very familiar with it since I wanted more of the Batman that I fell in love with, and since this was so different, I dismissed it at the time. But I have seen clips of it on YouTube, and it looks alright for what it is, and it does have some great fan service, but I still can't forgive it for eliminating the Batman. They would attempt to do a new Batman series in a similar vein a few years ago known as Beware the Batman, but that series didn't do particularly well, and now the closest things we have to a new Batman series is Lego Batman, which is okay for what it is, and Gotham, which the less said about that, the better. This is a series that I really wanted to talk about for a long time because it was a big step in my journey in becoming a comic book fan and a Batman fan, but I feel like it's gone unappreciated for far too long. But, much like Batman himself, sometimes the best things you can do will go unappreciated by everybody. But for now, I've had enough of this. I'm going on the other side to have a bath. Bye!